Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Automobiles. This is a 2 to 5 player game that has you racing around a track trying to beat your opponents to the finish line. The main mechanic of this game is bag building, where you have a bag full of different colored cubes that mean a variety of different things, but mostly push you forward at great speeds across this track. First I'll show you how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. In order to set up a game of Automobiles, we need to pick out the action cards. There are a variety of the different colored cards. There's 4 for each of these colored ones. We pull out a random one for each. We put them along here, along with the 4 speed gear cards, which never change. They're associated with the gray and black cubes. Then every player grabs all of their white cubes and they put them in their bag. You notice that white is associated with 3rd gear here. They'll also start with 2 of these gray cubes, which are associated with 4th gear, and then 5 of these garage cubes, which for this game will be associated with the car chief. They throw those into their bag, but before they're able to start the game, each player has the opportunity to buy more cubes for their bag. Now these are the starting positions. We have purple in first, and if you'll notice underneath the cards we see a $10, $11, and $12, and this is the amount of money that each player can spend to put more cubes into their bag. If you look at the cards down here, you'll see a price in the top right or left-hand corner, depending on the type of card, and each player is going to spend up to that amount of money putting those cubes into their bag to start the game. For instance, the purple player might buy 1 gray cube for $2, 1 purple cube for another $2, and then they could grab 2 of these dark gray cubes for $3 each. That gets them to $10. That gets thrown into their bag and they're done, and then each other player will do the same. To start the game, the purple player is going to pull out 7 of these cubes and put them into their active area. And now they're going to start activating these cubes. Now, the non-colored cubes, essentially the whites, grays, and blacks, those are essentially associated with just going fast on the track. So you can take these cubes and just put them out on the track to show a hypothetical path that your car is going to take. So this is the purple car. They can put these white cubes on these little white spots here. They've got a couple of these light gray cubes. They can move diagonally into this spot and go there, and finally this is next to a dark gray spot, so they can shift and go all the way over here. That's going to be the distance that they get to drive on this turn. Now, these yellow cubes are associated with the car chief ability, and as you can see, it says remove 1 gear cube from your discard pile to gain 1 gear cube of 1 higher. Now, unfortunately, they don't have any gear cubes in their discard pile at this point in the game, but instead they can keep these for buying cards during the buy phase. So once they've activated all these cubes, they now shift into that. For this buying phase, you take all the cubes that are still left in your active area and you move them to the used area, and you get buying power equal to the number of dollar signs on that respective color. So these are both yellow. So the yellow is 2 dollar signs, so that's 4 buying power that the purple player now has to purchase as many of these cubes as they want to in order to throw them into their used pile in order to get them into the bag eventually. So now let's briefly talk about what these different cubes do. You saw what these gear cubes can do out on the map. You just put the cubes out, and the darker the color, the longer the stretch of that chunk is on the map, but you have to get close to it. And these color ones down here give you actions. We know what the yellow one does already. It can upgrade a gear cube from your discard pile to one better. So if you had a light gray cube in your discard, you could get rid of it and take a dark gray cube instead. The purple one is really simple. You can remove up to 6 cubes from your discard pile, just getting rid of them. There will be cubes you want to get rid of, and I'll show you where cubes in just a minute, but it's a way to streamline your bag. We have the red, which says gain aware, and then move 1 space matching 1 gear in your discard pile. So this is one way that you're going to get these terrible brown wear cubes that just gunk up your engine, but when you take this, you also get the benefit of being able to utilize a gear cube that you've already used on a previous turn that's in your discard pile, and that's great. This green one over here lets you draw 2 cubes from your bag, put 1 into your active pile, and then 1 into your discard pile. So it lets you kind of dig through your bag a little bit faster to pull out the exact ones you need, and sometimes make combos. You could put something in your discard pile and then maybe upgrade it depending on what type of cube that is. And finally, we can look over here at the blue one. It says supercharged. You're going to gain a wear cube for doing this, and then it says you get to place up to 2 cubes from your discard pile back into your active pile. So this one's really powerful. It lets you reuse cubes that you used on previous turns. Essentially, you're going to take a wear cube in order to utilize your best cubes most likely. So let's say the purple player decided to spend all 4 of their buying power to take this green. It'll now go into their used pile, and now they actually move into the moving car phase. So they take their car, and it's going to follow the path of all the cubes that they put out on the board up to the farthest extent that they could, and then all these cubes are going to get grabbed and put into the used pile as well. Unfortunately, we now go to the decline phase of a turn, where a car takes wear and tear based on how fast they went. You look at this little graph, and you find the row that matches the color of the darkest part of the track that the car went on. In this case, it'd be the dark gray. So we look here, and that means they're going to take 3 of these wear cubes, and those are going to go right into their discard pile, essentially gunking up their engine and slowing the car down in the future. It is important to note that there's an extra mechanic called drafting, where if you end your turn with your car behind another car, in this case, there are 2 slots where cars could fit, so if this car had driven over here, it could have stayed there, or it could have gone here if it didn't have the right cube for that. You're still technically behind this car, and that means when you're right behind, you draft, and you don't take any wear cubes at all. So it's very beneficial to end a turn behind somebody else's car. So this wear goes into the discard pile, and then so do all of the cubes that they had in the use section. And finally, we have the cleanup phase, where we're going to go ahead and draw 7 more cubes from our bag. We put those into the active pile, and we can start thinking about what we want to do with these cubes while everybody else is taking their turns. If you ever need to take cubes out of the bag and you don't have enough, then you immediately take all the cubes that are currently in the discard pile, throw those in the bag, and keep drawing until you have the right amount. Whenever a car crosses the checkered line, you're going to advance your lap marker by 1 on this track over here. Once a player advances into the finish lap part, then everybody else is going to finish their turns, and whoever is farthest past the finish line is going to be the victor of the game. The last thing I want to briefly show you is the other map. We have kind of a symmetrical oval map here, but if we turn the board upside down, you'll see that there is more of a Formula 1 style map here, where you have a very long straightaway with these black connections connected together, and a couple more turns. It's a little more interesting looking of a map. So now let's begin the review, and we'll start with a few positive points. The first of these relates to the bag building mechanism that is centralized to this entire game. It is wonderfully well done in this game. It's not the first time that bag building has been done. And again, this is, instead of a deck building game with cards, here you have a bag and you're throwing colorful cubes into this bag and then randomly pulling some number of them out and evaluating them. So it has that engine building vibe of, putting in the right color cubes that are kind of work with the other cubes that you've already purchased, but also some randomness because you're not sure how they're going to come out. When you add onto that, something that I have not seen with deck builders or bag builders that much either, is the amount of bad stuff that gets thrown into this bag too with the wear cubes. Like, that is a lot. You pretty much every turn putting multiple bad cubes that are going to gunk up your engine into that bag, and so you're constantly trying to deal with that. You pull out a handful of cubes, there might be a bunch of wear in there, and that's going to really slow you down in a given turn, and it means you have to focus on trying to get rid of those cubes. And many bag or deck building games have a emphasis on streamlining and getting things out of a bag, and this one has that from the very beginning because there's always something that you want to get rid of from inside that bag, which is a very neat concept. Also, I like the way you pull the cubes out, you put them out in front of you, and you can develop a plan for your turn. You oftentimes have multiple different options that you can do, and usually one of them is best, but it's fun figuring out what the best thing to do is, and then you move your car around the track and then potentially buy more cubes, and it's rarely obvious what the best move is there. So it's just a really good combination of a already well-established mechanic of bag building, but I like how streamlined and elegant it is in this game. That's pretty much the main thing you're doing with not much other frills attached. Positive number 2 relates to the great variety of cards that come in the game. Now, these are the ones that are associated with the colored cubes that you can throw into your bag. I'm not talking about the black and gray gear cubes, I'm talking about the blue and red and fuchsia cubes. And each one of these cubes has 4 different cards that could be associated with it for that game. So when you randomly pick these cards out and put them on the table, it's going to give you a different experience each time. And I'm essentially telling you how great the replayability is here as well. I'm going to go into it again later on in the video, but the replayability of this game is so high, and it's a humongous strength of the game. It's worth being a positive point because you will be sitting down to a pretty different experience each time you play the game based off of the abilities that are present. And as a nice bonus, most of these abilities are pretty great and interesting to evaluate as well, which I'll talk about again in just a second. So positive number 3 is the wonderful combos that these different cards can give you, like I was just alluding to. The big part of the game is looking at the different actions and figuring out how they are going to interact with each other, because sometimes there are some really great, almost super combos that can emerge when this one card and that one card happen to be out, and people will definitely be gunning to do that. But the next time you play the game, that super combo won't be there, so there's a lot of fun in trying to figure out what the next combo is for this specific set of cards that you have in front of you. And then, in addition to just seeing a good combo and a good way that these cubes are going to work, you want to try and make that happen by buying the right cubes, putting them in the bag, maybe reducing the other cubes that might be in the bag to make sure that those great big combos happen really well for you and often. And that just adds more and more layers to the game. It also means that these combos ramp up as the game gets going, so it kind of feels like the first lap is slow, and then the second lap is fast, and the third lap can sometimes be almost one turn, which is pretty humongous. So now I want to discuss one neutral point, and that has to do with the multiplayer solitaire nature to the game. Now, it's not entirely multiplayer solitaire. There are a couple ways in which the players are going to interact, but for the most part, while you're playing this game, you kind of feel like you're doing your own thing. You're trying to go as fast as you possibly can around the track. You're trying to buy the cubes well, and you're trying to use the cubes really well. And what your opponents are doing is not of huge importance to you. Now, of course, it is very advantageous to end a turn right behind an opponent because you're drafting and you're not going to put those wear cubes into your bag, and wear cubes are terrible. They really gum up the work, so it's good to not have those so you are aware of where your opponents are on the board, but when it's your turn, they're kind of stagnant. It's not like they're actively moving. It's just like they are potentially an obstacle or potentially a boon to you if you're able to end right behind them. And occasionally, I've seen situations where somebody gets completely blocked off by like a wall of cars and they just can't get by even though they have the cubes for it. And that's certainly not multiplayer solitaire at that point, where people are actively blocking you. And that is an aspect to the game. Like, there is definite benefits to blocking your opponents, and you can look over and see the cubes they have in front of them and try to get in their way and make their turn less efficient or just stall out entirely if that's possible. But in general, this game mostly plays like a multiplayer solitaire experience, which is certainly not a bad thing. It's just something I think you should know going in. For my one negative, I want to discuss runaway leader syndrome in this game. It's something I've seen happen a couple times, not every single game, but enough to have it be a worry. This is an engine building game. You are putting these cubes into your bag, and if you do that well, then you are going to have a really good engine. But there is an amount of luck that comes from grabbing a certain bad hand of cubes. You could get a whole bunch of wear, for instance, or just a perfect, amazing combo. And sometimes those amazing combos will allow them to get rid of a bunch of wear and other things to set themselves up for another amazing combo and another amazing combo. And it seems like you can have somebody just ramp into an amazing set, and oftentimes the person who wins is somebody who completes that last lap in like pretty much one turn. And I have seen on a couple occasions where players are lapped on the board in that one turn, and they really don't feel like they have a way to get back into the game. Now, the game is not terribly long. It usually plays in about an hour, so it's not the worst thing in the world when someone really gets their engine going, and I guess thematically that makes sense. They just whip around the track. But photo finishes are pretty rare, and photo finishes are fun in racing games in general. You want to be neck and neck right up to the end, as opposed to have someone pull the cubes out and be like, oh, go almost all the way around the board, and everybody else goes like a third or half of that, and well, this game is pretty much over at that point. Sometimes you can tell even when you are a turn 2 out from that point. So it is a bit of a bummer. It dulls down the fun of those specific gameplay experiences, but like I said, it hasn't happened every time, but enough times to be a little worrisome. The replayability for automobiles is way above average in my opinion. And I've already talked about this to a certain degree in the positive number 2, because you have 4 different cards that are associated with each colored cube that you get to throw in the bag and evaluate every game. So you will have different puzzles and different sets of these great actions to use every time you play. On top of that, there are 2 different racetracks that you can play. You flip the board over, and one is kind of a symmetrical oval track, and the other one is kind of more Formula 1-esque that is asymmetric and has like a really big straightaway with 2 black spots right next to each other, and then a whole bunch of like tight corners and that kind of thing. So when it comes to a variety of experiences that are mechanically baked into this box, it's doing a really good job. It's got a ton of it. Because those actions are somewhat varied in what they do, like they're kind of all over the place, and oftentimes there are some pretty good combos that can be made between those, like I talked about in positive point number 3. It means that each time you sit down to play the game, you have the fun of trying to figure out what the great combo is this game, and you will probably find yourself taking very different types of cubes and putting them in your bag and playing a different race most of the times you sit down to play this game. Of course, it's the same game every time you sit down, but the way you are going to be racing around that track feels different enough to give it a way above average replayability score. Automobiles plays 2 to 5 players, and I've played all but the 2-player game at this point, and I think that the sweet spot for this game is going to be 4 players. The 3-player game worked, but you have less opportunities to block somebody, kind of get in their way on the board, which is interesting. You have less opportunities to draft, which is also an interesting decision that you want to have on your turn. And I imagine in the 2-player game that would be even worse. Like, there's only one other person out on the board. I imagine drafting happens very rarely. Blocking is going to be almost non-existent. This is a racing game. You want to have other cards out there jostling around on the track. And I did play a 5-player game at one point, and it was enjoyable. I would totally play that again. There was a lot of chaos, and I think there were a couple pretty significant blocks where people like lost their entire turn because they just could not get by this wall of cars as everybody was kind of jumbled up in the early to mid game. That being said, the 5-player game did feel like it went a little bit long, so that's why I think 4-player is going to be the best for this game, but 3 to 5 has played great. In conclusion, I think that Automobiles is a great package of some really good ideas. It has a wonderful amount of variety in those action cards, and it is a elegant, simple bag building experience where you have the joy of kind of building an engine and then seeing it work and seeing it sometimes not work as it gets gunked up with those wear cubes and you try and get them out. It can evoke emotion when you're pulling these cubes out of the bag and putting them on your player board and trying to do the best you can. Sometimes that emotion is frustration, especially if you pull a handful of wear cubes out a couple turns in a row, but if you're doing that, maybe you're not drafting enough and maybe you could play the next game a little bit better than the one that you're playing right there. I will admit this game is not seeing the table that often for me. I enjoyed it every time I've played it. It's been a fun time, but I'm not particularly excited to keep having it hit the table despite the fact that there is quite a bit of replayability in there. But that being said, I do look forward to playing it again in the future. It's a really neat bag building racing experience and it's just been a fun time for me. I'd like to thank everybody who's been supporting the channel through Patreon, including the producer level pledges. If you too would like to directly support the channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.